Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Meg Kilgannon, filling in for Tony Perkins. We're really happy to have you here this afternoon. Earlier today, the FDA gave full approval for the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine for individuals 16 years of age and older. The announcement is expected to boost the vaccination rate and set up more clashes over vaccine mandates. The Pentagon has already jumped on it, saying this morning that it would accelerate plans to mandate vaccination for active duty troops.
So now that the Pfizer vaccine has been approved, the department is prepared to issue updated guidance requiring all service members to be vaccinated. A timeline for vaccination completion will be provided in the coming days.
With students returning to school and some companies preparing to mandate the vaccine for their employees, what's the recourse for those seeking religious exemption? Joining me now to talk about this is Mike Berry, General Counsel for First Liberty Institute, whose office was already receiving hundreds of requests for legal help on the issue prior to the FDA's announcement today. Mike, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
There's so much I'd like to cover today, and we have only 15 minutes, so I'd like to make sure we cover three aspects of this that you cover so well in your toolkit: help for the military objectors, help for students or government employees, and help for employees of private companies that'll mandate vaccines as a condition of employment. But are there a couple of key takeaways you want to give us before we dive into those issues?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway right now is that it's obviously a very confusing and complex environment for a lot of people. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of misinformation. It seems like the rules are changing daily for a lot of people. And so the real important takeaway for most folks is regardless of who your employer is or what your status is as a student, as an employer, as an employee, you absolutely have available to you two forms of religious exemption or religious accommodation, and that can be a medical exemption or a religious accommodation. And we're encouraging people, if you believe that you're eligible for one of those, then you absolutely should take advantage of that. But what goes hand in hand with that is that the mere fact that you have a right to apply or to request a medical exemption or religious accommodation doesn't guarantee that it'll be granted. And there are times and circumstances where perhaps the denial of one of those might be appropriate under the law, and there are times when those will not be appropriate under the law. And at First Liberty Institute, we're encouraging people to reach out to us so that we can evaluate those on a case-by-case basis.
Great. So let's start with military personnel. What are you hearing from our service members, and what help can you give them?
Well, the latest numbers in the military are that approximately 80%, it may be a little bit higher than 80% now, but roughly 80% of all active duty service members, so this doesn't include the National Guard, doesn't include the reserve, just the active component, roughly 80% has been fully vaccinated, meaning that 20%, approximately 260,000 service members have not been vaccinated. If we want to take just a very conservative estimate of that and say, if of those 250,000 who have not been vaccinated, 10% have a religious objection to being vaccinated, then we're talking about 25,000 people. If 25,000 service members have a religious objection, then I think the Department of Defense really needs to take a hard look at why it's making this a no exceptions across the board mandate, and saying that it's potentially going to violate the religious rights, the First Amendment rights of, again, by conservative estimates, 25,000 service members. That would be terrible for our constitutional rights and probably terrible from a medical science perspective.
It certainly would be ironic to consider that the soldiers who are protecting us and protecting our rights to religious freedom would not be able to exercise them themselves. That would really be an unfortunate situation. We know military service is a family affair. Will this impact family members of the military? Do you have any indication of that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, it's a very common occurrence. Anybody who's served in the military, who's watching or listening, knows that it's very common for, if the husband or the wife, whichever spouse is on active duty in the military, the other spouse might potentially have a job as a civilian employee within the DoD. They might work on base. Because we hire, again, the Department of Defense is one of the largest employers in the country. And those employees might also be under this mandate, even though they're not on active duty. So yes, it is a family affair, just as you said, and it can have far-reaching impacts beyond just the service members themselves, their spouses, their children, their dependents, et cetera. And so again, I want to reiterate that our Pentagon officials and leaders really I think they need to do a better job of taking a long, hard look at how they roll out this mandate and the types of exemptions and accommodations that they're willing to make available to service members, and to ensure they should be sending out messages right now to say no service member, no dependent will face any sort of punishment or adverse treatment simply because they want to take advantage of something the law guarantees, a medical exemption or religious accommodation.
That would be wonderful to see happen. Let's shift now over to the education space, which may cover some of the government employee aspect of this too. Over 700 universities across the country have required vaccines for students. Some of those have also required them for employees and professors. Do you have resources for students to help them navigate this if they would like to exercise a religious exemption?
Yeah, once again, we encourage people to go to firstliberty.org. There's a button at the top of the screen that says get legal help or request legal help. We're happy to provide what we call a vaccine toolkit. The toolkit covers a lot of the bases that you and I are talking about. Public employees, military service members, private employees. We try to make it as much of a one-size-fits-all as we can, or really more of a buffet. You can take what you want and leave the rest. But there is no silver bullet here, right? There's no, if I just use these magic words, then the government has to give me what I want. And I want to reiterate that. But when it comes to students, especially in the university setting, this is where it can get very complicated. If you live in a state like Texas or Florida, where the governors and legislatures of those states have essentially banned vaccine requirements or so-called vaccine passports, et cetera, then public universities in those states likely cannot make getting a vaccine a condition of returning to school. But private universities in many instances can. Now, there may be other ways that those state legislatures can prevent private universities from making vaccines mandatory, such as withholding certain types of funding, et cetera. But again, like I said, it's a very complicated environment out there, and we encourage people to come to firstliberty.org so that they can allow us, the experts, to really guide them through it.
Right. And I think it would be useful to talk about the difference between, or the similarities in, a religious exemption versus a religious accommodation as we shift over to talk about, from the public sphere, to talk about what employees of privately owned companies can expect. Do they have rights to religious accommodations, and if their employers start mandating vaccines as a condition of employment?
Yeah, I mean, the basic rules for private employers that obviously if you're a private employer, if you're a small business owner and you run your own company, then yes, I mean, we've argued for years that private business owners, especially faith-based business owners, should be able to run their businesses according to their own sincerely held beliefs. And if you're a private business owner and you want to require all of your employees to be vaccinated, then for the most part, that's something that you're probably going to be able to do. However, there is something called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And if you have a business that has 15 or more employees, then you're subject to Title VII. And you have to make available at least the ability to request a religious accommodation. Again, that doesn't mean that you have to grant that religious accommodation in every instance. So for those who are employees of private companies out there, yes, you can request a religious accommodation, but the mere fact that you request it doesn't mean that it's going to be granted. And if it's denied on inappropriate grounds, or if it's denied unlawfully, then yeah, you have a right to appeal that. You could file a complaint of discrimination with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for religious discrimination. And again, there's no guarantee that that will be successful in court. Just to be honest, I think a lot of these, it's going to be an uphill climb for people, but there are going to be a substantial number of people whose religious accommodation requests are denied inappropriately and improperly, and they absolutely should have legal recourse available to them.
Sure, and we know there's always comfort in numbers and power in numbers, and the more people of faith exercise their right to religious exemptions, the more everyone will understand the need for that and the importance of it. Do you have any advice for those who are seeking exemptions on medical grounds?
Yeah, I mean I'm not a doctor. That's not an area where I have any nearly as much expertise as I do when it comes to constitutional law and religious liberty. But I would say, just from a practical standpoint, let's use the military as an example. What I don't understand is why the Department of Defense is not looking at the fact that many service members have already contracted and recovered from COVID. And if you've recovered, then it's very likely that you have the antibodies present in your system. And why can't we do a simple antibody test to see whether or not somebody already has the COVID antibodies present, which would then make the need for a vaccine minimal, if necessary at all. And in the law, when somebody requests a religious accommodation and they can show that the requirement that they get this vaccine substantially burdens their sincerely held religious beliefs, the government has to show that it has a compelling government interest in requiring you to get this vaccine. And it also has to show that getting the vaccine is the least restrictive means of accomplishing whatever its stated goal is. And it seems to me that testing people and saying, well, have you already had COVID? And if you have and you've recovered, then maybe you don't need to get the vaccine. That seems to be medically sound. As far as everything that I've read in the literature and all the data that I've seen, most medical experts would agree if you've already had it and recovered, then you probably have the antibodies in your system and the vaccine is probably not nearly as effective. In fact, your natural immunization is probably far stronger than an artificial immunization. And so, going back to your question about then what advice would I give to somebody who wants a medical exemption or a medical waiver? I would say, go talk to your primary care provider, get the antibody test, see if you have those antibodies present, and see if you get some other blood work done to see maybe you have some sort of allergic reaction that you are susceptible to, that your medical provider says, you know what, you probably shouldn't get the vaccine because it may actually have an adverse reaction. And we know for a fact that there are many people who have been suffering from adverse reactions to these vaccines. And so, again, we shouldn't be dispensing these vaccines as a one size fits all, everybody get them, no exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that's bad from a legal standpoint, and that's bad from a medical standpoint.
Sure. We didn't quite finish up on the difference between the religious exemption or religious accommodation. Could you make that clear for the audience, please?
Yeah, so legally speaking, there's a difference between the two. I'll start with this and say, from a practical standpoint, there really isn't that much of a difference to the ordinary everyday American in terms of the effect that it would actually have on them. But the legal nuance between an exemption and an accommodation is an exemption is actually saying or asking to be exempt from a law. In other words, to say, I don't think this law should apply to me for whatever the facts or circumstances are, right? I should be exempt from having to comply with this law. Whereas an accommodation says, look, I'm not challenging this law or whether this law is valid or whether this law should apply. I'm simply asking to be accommodated from it. So in other words, the law can continue to apply, but I have unique facts and circumstances in my life that are such that I'm asking for it not to be applied to me in this particular or specific instance. Whereas an exemption is probably a little bit broader and just saying, I'm asking for this law not to apply to me, period. So I realize that, getting down into the weeds and some legal nuance, but again, from a practical standpoint, in terms of the effect that it would have on somebody who's making the request, it would largely be transparent. And when it comes to a religious objector, we typically refer to that as a religious accommodation, not a religious exemption. And from a medical standpoint, it's often referred to as a medical exemption as opposed to a medical accommodation. So that's really the main difference, I think.
So we have about 2 minutes left. Are there other avenues for those who are vaccine hesitant or simply do not want to get the vaccine? Are there other?
That's a tough question. I mean, it's one that we face every single day here at First Liberty. The ultimate question of, well, what if my religious accommodation is denied, or what if my employer threatens to fire me, or if I'm in the military, what if the military threatens to court-martial me? Are they going to do that? I will say that the Pentagon so far has stopped short of saying we will court-martial service members if they refuse, but they have left it open as a possibility. They've certainly left court-martial on the table. So for those who are facing that sort of a scenario of loss of job, loss of employment, getting kicked out of the military and court-martialed, I would say, again, start with your primary care provider. Talk to your doctor. See if you might be eligible for a medical exemption, and then combine that together with a religious accommodation. I think that's probably the strongest possible scenario, is that you have both a medical exemption and a religious accommodation. And if it's denied, again, contact First Liberty Institute. We're happy to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis.
Great, Mike. Thank you so much for your work in this area. I know that our audience will be really interested to visit your website. We're very happy that you've been with us today.